I'd like to welcome you to Chapter 4 of our textbook, which will cover tissues and how tissues contribute to body organs. So this is going to be, again, a pretty involved lecture, but your main goal is to understand the four major tissue types and what these cells do and how they fit into organ function. So when we look at how we categorize tissues, we're going to be focusing obviously on human tissues, but what's really kind of neat is we share very similar tissues to other animals, including even worms. And literally under the microscope, it's sometimes very difficult to tell, what belongs to what. Like, for example, if you're looking at what we call squamous cells right here, they're almost identical within all animals. Muscle may vary a little, and maybe blood cells may vary a little. But overall, we're going to see that what these tissues do is they contribute to organ function. Now, by definition, what a tissue is, it's um, it's groups of cells that are very similar in structure and function. And these cells work together usually in a unit. So tissues are not just individual cells doing their job, which sometimes individual cells do, but it's cells working together and communicating to carry out one particular mission. Now, typically what we do is we classify tissues microscopically, okay, not really as much as where they come from, but microscopically into epithelial tissue, which we're going to see produces coverings and also forms glands. Connective tissue, which helps support other tissues, basically supports the body, okay, and also forms our blood. Muscle tissue, which we're going to see provides movement in various ways, and also nerve tissue, which we're going to see that there's two major components to that, those of which provide communication and those which support the nervous system. So again, when we look at these tissue types, we can look at nervous tissue here, and some examples would be your brain, basically your spinal cord, okay, which makes up the central nervous system. It makes up what are called here. We have peripheral nerves, and you can see coming out of our spine. We will also have these things called parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves. We look at muscle tissue. There's what's called skeletal muscle tissue, and we can see some right here, there, and there's your little biceps. Okay, we can see cardiac tissue, which skeletal and cardiac are also considered what's called striated tissue, and there's your heart right there. Okay, and we're going to see it's a very thick tissue, and what's neat about cardiac tissue is that it contains those little gap junctions that allow direct cell-to-cell communication and actually the sharing of cytoplasm between cells. And then there's the what's called the smooth muscle you'll see, and that's going to be in the lining of different organs, particularly organs that require excretion, secretion, or movement of something. And then we get into epithelial tissue. We're going to see which covers the skin. Epithelium is found usually on the in membranes, surface of the skin, and lining many body organs. And then we look at connective tissue, which, as the name implies, we can find in bone, okay, tendons, what we also call cartilage, which you can't see too much here. Okay, it's removed here, and also fat, and making up our circulatory system. So we're going to begin with epithelial tissue. And epithelial tissue, again, is a very thin tissue that forms membranes. The cells are very simple. We're going to see that epithelial tissue is mostly made up of cells. That's literally all you see, unless it's attached to connective tissue, which again is a separate tissue. So we're going to see that there's two types. One type that's called lining or covering epithelium, and this is found both internally and externally in the body. And then there's going to be glandular epithelium, and it's there not so much to make a cover. Of course it can, but some of them are specialized just to produce secretions and to excrete material. Excretion is a waste product. Secretion is something that's intentionally produced by the body to carry out a function, sort of like mucus or hormonal secretions. So when we look at epithelial, what you need to know is epithelial cells have what's called polarity. That means they have a top and bottom to them. And usually the bottom is attached to another group of cells or to connective tissue or to some other matrix in the body. Um, we also find they have a top surface, an apical surface. Apex just means the top, basal means the bottom. The apical surface usually carries out the job of the epithelium, whether it's a secretion or acts as a cushion or as kind of like a lubricated surface, like serous membranes. So you can the apical surface can sometimes be covered with microvilli, you'll see, and also with cilia, okay, particularly in the lining of the trachea. Um, Almost all epithelial is directly attached to a secreted membrane called the basal lamina, and this is actually composed of what we call extracellular glycoproteins. That means basically sugary proteins, and these proteins and sugary substances help attach the cells to surfaces. And sometimes underlying that glycoprotein surface, sometimes called the glycocalyx, okay, is going to be connective tissue. And it's going to be hard to see these glycoproteins and also what are called collagen fibers. Collagen being the material that makes up bone and cartilage, you'll see later. Another characteristic of epithelial tissue is they're heavily compacted with cells, and you'll see this under a microscope. They're generally continuous sheets of cells held together by tight junctions. That means nothing can pass between these cells, and also desmosomes, which means they're really welded together hard. And I remembered a few times that I did get sunburned for being stupid out in tropical environments in full sun is when I burned and then my skin peeled off and those desmosomes still held that dead skin together as the skin pulled off in sheets. Okay. Again, epithelium, usually that lower layer of the epithelium, that glycoprotein layer is attached to some type of connective tissue, okay, underneath again the basal lamina. And what's neat about epithelium too, it is avascular. That means it doesn't really have its own blood supply built in. Now, a blood supply may run near it, but it only covers the surface and is not embedded. And you'll see this when we look at the skin. The upper layers of skin, the actual epithelial layers of skin, has no blood vessels in it, although they're nearby. But you will see, like in body cavities, blood vessels, but again, they're lying on top or below the tissue and sometimes in the connective tissue underneath the basal lamina, but not directly in there. Now, epithelial tissue can have innervation. That means nerves can be embedded in it, and you'll see this again in skin, because skin is a perfect example of looking at a very complex epithelial tissue. Now, another thing too is that epithelium has a high rate of regeneration. That means when these cells die, they can be replaced rapidly, sometimes twice as fast as regular cells as they undergo mitosis. So they have a high rate of regeneration, which makes them very susceptible to DNA damage, but also DNA repair, and sometimes erroneous DNA repair that leads to mutations. They're also very susceptible to cancers and benign tumors. And mostly what you see in this tissue are benign tumors. It means unusual growths that are flaws in that high metabolic rate that they use for regeneration. Now, when we classify epithelium, and this is to be your job in class, you're going to have to know this, how to recognize these different types of epithelium. So how do we classify them? Since these are solid sheets of cells, what we can do is classify them based on how many layers they're made of. And usually it's going to be one layer or many. But sometimes we have what are called simple epithelium. That means it's just one sheet, very thin, almost transparent layers. And then we're going to see that they can be made up of two or more. And usually it's going to be more. We don't find too many epithelia that are just 2, 3, 4 layers. Usually it's going to be more than that. And we call these stratified, because stratified just means they're stacked upon each other. And again, these stacks don't have blood vessels within the stacks. You could find nerves, but not blood vessels. Okay, now, so that's one way. The other way we classify them is by the type of cell. And we're going to see that there are flat type of epithelials called squamous. Squamous actually means flat, and these sort of look like, fried eggs or like pancakes or like, soft taco shells, before they're rolled up. So they're pretty much kind of like pancake-like. Cuboidal are square. Now they could be perfectly square, they could be round looking, And this is going to be a giveaway too, so they could be square, somewhat stubby, rectangular, or round. Okay. Columnar. These are going to be oblong, and these are going to be definitely distinctly long. Now, sometimes we have what are called short columnar, but they still look rectangular. Okay, so these are going to be more rectangular like cells. And you're going to see the nucleus is usually going to be somewhere towards one side or the other, unlike being in the middle almost, or apparently in the middle, like you see in cuboidal and squamous. And usually epithelial cells have a very big nucleus because these cells are usually very highly metabolic, producing lots of chemicals. So you see this very huge nucleus compared to the cytoplasm. So now let us look at the layers that they can form. And what you're looking at here is actually a squamous cell. We'll see that a little later. And notice here's your groupings of cells, single layer, tight junctions and desmosomes. They just don't show the junctions there. There's almost no gap here. There's nothing that can pass through these two cells. Everything has to pass literally into the cell membrane, cytoplasm, and whatever to get into the body. There's your basement membrane. And then this would be connective tissue. So that's your propyl lamina and then your connective tissue. Okay, and of course your apical surface, your basal surface. Here's a stratified. Now notice these tend to be more squamous-like. These are more cuboidal-like, and that's a problem. You have to name them based on the upper layer, because these lower layers are actually not mature squamous. They are immature squamous, or stem cell squamous, which is almost cuboidal in appearance. So what you're seeing here is these cells are producing no cells and producing new cells along this line and pushing these cells out. And as they mature in age, they become more squamous. So you find something like this in skin. So they're simple and stratified. Now when we look at the shapes, okay, of course now we have the squamous from the top. They look round, but you can usually see them in tight sheets. Okay, there's your flat part. That's looking at it from the side or laterally. Here's your cuboidal. You're looking at them from an angle. Now you're looking at them from straight on top or from the side. And this is meant to be a side or lateral view. And there's your columnar. They sometimes look circular from the top. You got to be careful. And then here they are on the lateral view. So when we look at these cells, to show them from the top is going to be a problem when we look at them under the microscope, because we're going to see that from the top, they're all going to look almost alike. So we're going to look at them mostly from the side, what we call transverse cuts. So it's going to be difficult sometimes to see the squamous because it'll be such small flat sheets, very tiny flat cells, you might not really see the cells. But so when we look at these, I'm not going to trick you by having you look from the top, even though when you look at slide specimens in real life, you'll get both top views, side views, and oblique views, which can kind of throw things off, particularly for the columnar cells. We'll see a little later. So for what we're going to do now is an overview of the epithelial tissues, the major types in your body. We're going to do a little brief description, their function and location, which is something you have to be prepared to provide on a final, but on an exam and also on the practicals, the lab exams, that is. So here's simple squamous epithelium, and you're going to get slides that look just like this. Now understand when you're looking at this, this is a flat sheet. That's an oblique view. We're looking at it from kind of like an angle. The slide that you're showing here, okay, is looking at just this aspect right here. You're looking at straight on, looking down on it. So this is actually an individual squamous cell right here. There's the nucleus, and that's the cytoplasm. There's another one. And there's another one looking at from the side. Now notice there's one from the top. That one actually shed off. There's another one from the top. And this happens to be lung tissue from the alveoli, your air sacs. So this is little sheets of cells rolled up into little balls that we call alveoli. And what's neat about it is this is where oxygen then diffuses into your blood. There'll be blood vessels here that are actually on the surface of these cells. You don't see a blood vessel here because it's just one was not included in the picture. And also CO2. okay, is released into these cavities. And these cavities eventually connect to your bronchial system that allows the mouth to inhale this, or your nose to inhale this and exhale this. So these squamous cells are found right down here in these little structures called the alveoli. Now, simple squamous is found in two other locations besides forming the linings, I should say the alveoli of the lungs. They also form what's called endothelium and mesothelium. Endothelium usually lines blood vessels, heart, and what's called lymphatic vessels. And this is a very problematic epithelium, this endothelium, because it is very sensitive to fats in the diet. Some people have a genetic tendency of this epithelium being damaged and scarring and forming what are called plaques. If they have a particular type of white blood cell that tends to love eating saturated fats in the diet, this epithelium can clog, okay, clog up with fat. Okay, it also could rupture, and we've now know that if you have type 2 diabetes or other conditions, this could inflame and eventually cause damage to that lining and make the blood more susceptible to clotting and to forming a viscous blood, a very thicker blood in that location. So this is a very important lining, and we know this is responsible for some of the body damage, particularly associated with the blood vessel decay in diabetic people. And then there's mesothelium, which is found mostly in body cavities, and it is a serous membrane, meaning it produces a liquidy lubricant fluid. And that fluid could be act as a cushion, it could be acting as a lubricant. And you'll see this usually comes in two actually distinct layers, not a double layer, but two distinct layers. Usually what we call a visceral inner layer and a parietal covering over that. Here's your columnar now. Notice what you're looking at is this image right there, and there's an individual columnar cell. That's the nucleus, and in this case, you're looking at the stomach. So what you're looking at is a little, what are called rugae here, and you see that little area there. That's all the secretory area, and a specialized surface here that allows an increase in surface area for absorption of materials from the stomach in. These cells are mostly secretory though, and not so much involved in absorption. So they produce lots of things. There's specialized gland cells in here that are also epithelial that produce mucus. They call them goblet cells. I don't see any here. You'll see some a little later and in class. They also have what are called parietal cells and other cells that secrete bicarbonate, a buffer that that adjusts the pH of the stomach, and also hydrochloric acid, which produces the acidity of the stomach. So again, this will be glandular, but also act as a covering. And these cells are very tough. You'll see a thick layer of mucus and bicarbonate on here that prevents the stomach acids, the hydrochloric acid, the HCl, from digesting away the stomach. Now, unfortunately, there are bacteria that love living in here, and they love breaking down these connections between the cells, these tight junctions and desmosomes, and they like to live inside, embedded between the cells. And this is responsible for a lot of ulceration in the stomach, because eventually the acids do attack that exposed region and can cause a breakdown of these epithelial cells. Then we have, and this is going to be kind of weird, what's called pseudostratified. That means from the side, they look like they overlap and that there's layers. But actually what it is these are cells that kind of limp and wrap around each other, but they're all attached to a single layer. The only place you find these in humans is in the trachea, the bronchial tree. That means between the tubular system that connects the lungs all the way up to the throat and up to the mouth. Okay, so these also have what's called a brush border or cilia, and the cilia basically waves a layer of mucus produced by this thing here called mucosal cells or goblet cells. There's the nucleus down there. So these big lumpy things produce mucus, and each individual cell here waves the cilia to move the mucus in one direction in a coordinated fashion. So here's one part of a columnar cell. That's the top of one, the bottom of another that wraps around that. It's a very confusing tissue. But if you use this picture to conceptualize it, just remember these. Now we get into what's called stratified squamous. Again, the most common place you find this is in our skin. And believe it or not, guys, your epithelium, your integumentary system, your skin actually runs into the lining of your mouth and your anus. So you will find on the inside of your lips and lining of your mouth actually this type of stratified squamous. So this is very confusing to see, but here's the bottom layer. And actually, it's a very thin layer of very flat cells. And then on top of that, layers of developing cells that eventually become squamous and flat. So they start out almost looking like they're somewhat flat cuboidals. There's one, there's one, there's one. Here's your connective tissue underneath that. We'll learn that a little later. So stratified squamous you'll usually see in the skin. And don't worry about right now non-characterized and keratinized forms. We'll learn that when we get into epithelium and integumentary system in the next chapter. And then the closest you come to another type of stratified is what's called transitional epithelium. This is basically, you can see from the cells, almost like a stratified cuboidal, because the outer cells, instead of becoming flat, stay round. And what this tissue does, there's your connective tissue layer, basement membrane, and then the cell. So these cells actually are stacked. And don't confuse this with columnar, pseudostratified, because look, you can see a separate cell on top. Pseudostratified columnar will not have that. So what these cells do is they can be stretched. That means these cells can be stretched out and they're very tightly held together so that it almost looks like a stratified squamous. So this is actually in the unstretched form. When these stretched, this stuff shrinks this way and these cells flatten out like pancakes. So you then have a layer that is that thin but all stretched out. And you can almost double the length of these. This is important in the urinary bladder. Okay, because as urine fills in, it allows this bladder to expand. So this is the major place we find this, and also in the urethra. That means the tube that leads from the bladder eventually to outside of the body. Now that we've looked at the different types of major epithelial categories, we're going to now look at what's called glandular epithelium. Glandular epithelium is typically going to be cuboidal. Sometimes it's going to be short columnar, but generally pure glands. That means an epithelium whose only job is to produce a gland and not to line, not to absorb, because usually columnar epithelial absorb materials. So this is that one that just produces usually secretions, sometimes excretions, but usually secretions. And how are they characterized? By their shape, the complexity, and also by whether they're what we call endocrine or exocrine. Endocrine means where are they secreted in the body. So in endocrine, they're secreted into the blood, the secretions from these cells. Okay, in certain glands, the secretions are produced in a duct, an actual tube that runs out of the gland, usually not into the blood, but into some type of body cavity, okay, or body opening. So first, endocrine glands, and we're going to go into endocrine much more detail. They're called ductless glands because these are glands that are usually near a blood supply. And what they do is they produce their secretion directly into the blood supply. Typically, endocrine glands secrete hormones that travel through the blood and sometimes through the lymph. And it says here to travel to target organs. That's not true. They travel everywhere in the body. It's just that these organs called target organs are specific at sensing these hormones and responding to these hormones in the blood. And they respond to very specific hormones for very specific jobs. Now, endocrine glands are usually found in endocrine organs or dispersed throughout the body, but they're definitely not as common and as visible as exocrine glands. So exocrine glands are the typical glands you hear about. Okay, they produce dozens and dozens of secretions, anything that could be like mucus to an enzyme to salts to whatever. So it produces lipids even. So it's a variety of materials that are all programmed by the DNA and basically regulated by the needs of the cell or the environment. Usually what they do, and you'll see what this looks like, their secretion goes into a duct. That means this cavity within the gland structure itself, and that duct could lead into the outside of the body, into tissues, wherever. So the secretions are typically released a lot of times in us through the skin, body surfaces a lot of times. This is where sweat comes from. Mucus usually is lining body cavities sometimes, and the linings of glands. So we see that mucus, sweat, oils, and salivary glands, that means the spit glands in your mouth, are all examples of exocrine glands. Now, we do see that we have these type of glands called unicellular glands. That means it's only one cell versus most glands are made up of dozens to hundreds of cells. These unicellular glands are also called goblet cells, and their main job is to produce mucus. And they're found dispersed, usually within other epithelial, particularly in the digestive system and the respiratory system. So, what are the ducted or exocrine glands? We have what are called simple duct exocrine glands. That means that they have little ducts. There's your cavity right there, and there's your duct. So we have a simple duct, and this is the gland itself. So when you look at the gland, this is where the secretions are being made, and they pour into that cavity. That's the duct that goes to some type of exit outside that tissue. So we can have simple, branched, okay, and these are called tubular. That means it's like a tube here. Then we have what's called alveolar. Alveolar means just like a little balloon. Okay, and again, these correlate very much together except the shape of the duct and the secretory cavity itself. We could have compound glands. So look at that. We do have a single duct there, but there's other ducts. So this part that's not colored darkly is the duct. That's the gland region. That's the gland region. That's the duct. And that's the duct. So we have compound, and then we have, and that could be broken up into compound tubular, compound alveolar, or compound tubulo-alveolar. Why do we do this to you? To torture you? It's just a genetic variation that we see, in the developmental variation we see in these glands. So just be aware of exocrine gland, that they come in simple, they do come in compound, and a lot of the complexity of these shapes also means that these glands do complex things. You find these complex type compound ones usually in breast tissue and certain what we call exocrine organs, secretory organs. Now when we look at the modes of secretion, and I love the terms, just guys deal with it because we're going to be talking about these when we get into organ systems. So we can classify secretions into merocrine or merocrine, depending on how you pronounce that, and holocrine or horocrine. So merocrine, basically, these secretions are produced by exocytosis, and they include basically liquidy secretions that sometimes contain salts, enzymes, waste products. And they can be produced by the pancreas, which produces a lot of enzymes, a lot of salts, salty materials that are needed for various body functions, particularly digestion, sweat for cooling and salt removal and waste removal, and also for cooling the body, and then the salivary glands of the mouth, which produce digestive enzymes that help to break down starches. So merocrine is usually a watery type secretion. And then there's holocrine. Holocrine is basically a secretion that's not a liquid. It's an oily, greasy substance, sometimes waxy, and it's produced by the rupture of the gland cells. And the actual, what you're doing sometimes is removing the fats from the gland cells, or some type of vacuole is actually being extruded. And in some cases, a whole dying dead cell itself is extruded. And you find that the cell actually breaks down and becomes a secretion itself. Doesn't that sound pretty? So they're liquidy or really broken down parts of cells. So here's a goblet cell. This is your simple glandular cell. And these are what are called the secretory vesicles. That means by exocytosis, the secretion in here, particularly mucus, this is mucus, is shot out of these cells. So there's little mucus, that's the mucus in little vesicles, and these get moved by exocytosis to the end. And there's your little cilia that then move the mucus in a particular direction. There's your nucleus. And this is the endoplasmic reticulum involved in producing that secretion. So when we look at epithelial membranes could be cutaneous. Cutaneous just means the covering of the body, the skin. And I hate all these terms, guys, but you got to know them. So here, this is a cutaneous membrane. Epithelial could also be internal membranes. Cutaneous membranes are usually very thick, make outside coverings. Okay, internal epithelial membranes are usually going to be mucous membranes, which we call mucosae. You'll hear that term when you get to the digestive system. Eventually in this course, they line body cavities. They're open to the exterior. And I hate to tell you this, guys. What we mean by open to the exterior, there's you, and you're sort of going to be like, you'll see this in a minute. You are actually a hollow tube, and that's your mouth. So you're a hollow tube, and I'm going to color the outside of the body here. So that's actually the outside of the body. And this holds true for your lungs too. So here's your mouth. Your mouth is an opening to a hollow tube. That means this is the external environment. So whatever goes in here, in your mouth, in your mouth, stays in this hollow tube until it's absorbed. And if it doesn't get absorbed, it comes out of your rear end. Okay, so this hollow tube is lined by mucosae. And that's what they mean is exterior. This is exterior to the body. It's in an environment of its own. Okay, it's not directly exposed to the environment like our cutaneous layer there. But this is usually going to be found, mucosae usually found lining the digestive system and the respiratory system. And the major job is to produce mucus, sometimes also other secretions, and also move that mucus around to either get things out of the lungs or to help transport waste products out of the body. So here's your mucosae again, showing you the lining of the lungs. Okay, and again, this is all exterior. And this is what's neat when you get into the respiratory system, guys. You're going to learn that here's your oxygen in your environment. Okay, and oxygen goes in here, down eventually to the alveoli, which they don't show. This is all outside of the body. That means that this oxygen, it's still outside of the body. It's just in a cavity within the body. So the oxygen concentration out here is the same in here. This oxygen eventually is transported into blood and eventually into your tissues, which then lowers that oxygen number. And then there's a certain amount of oxygen that's left over in the body called a residual. Is this lower amount is what allows this oxygen here to diffuse in. This oxygen is not facilitated by diffusion. This is facilitated by what's called bulk transport. That means you take a big chunk of oxygen, literally swallow it and put it here. But this is where the actual diffusion occurs. And the opposite is kind of true of CO2. CO2 moves its way out and then outside of the physical body. So again, when we look at epithelium and we look a little more in detail about serous membranes, so we have the serosei, which we just talked about, produce a fluidy lubricating liquid. And the serosei can come in two forms, what's called parietal, and let me give you an example of this. So let's make believe this is your thoracic cavity. So lining the whole thoracic cavity is going to be a parietal layer. Parietal means overall covering, like a fence. So that's parietal. Now there's also what's called a visceral covering. The visceral covering actually covers individual organs within a cavity. So here's your lungs now, and this would be more now what we call the visceral, because it envelops around each individual lung, and sometimes we call these the pleural sacs. So what's kind of neat when we talked about body damage can damage sometimes this parietal serosa, but maybe not the visceral. Most of the time, it's going to harm both. We have situations where a person has, let's say, tuberculosis, a bad respiratory infection, and that damages the visceral, but not the parietal. So this lung loses its function, but this lung can still function. Sometimes both of these break from the inside out, and that can create lung collapse of literally the whole thoracic cavity. So this is how this works. So with the serosi, we find that these can be specialized into double layer things, and they could be responsible for also uptake of oxygen and creating a vacuum, assisting at least with that process. Unfortunately, when we start talking about serous membranes, they get subnames based on where they are. So when you find a serous membrane lining the digestive system, okay, particularly the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, we call it a peritoneum. I love that, but it just means around, the digestive system basically. And then again, we have the parietal, which covers the whole digestive system. And then the visceral, okay, which intimately wraps individually around each organ. So you have two membranes, and what happens is when those organs move or shift due to movement of materials, either excretions, secretions, or peristalsis, smooth muscle activity, it allows this outer membrane to rub against the inner membrane and lubricate each other. And then we have the same is true for the heart here too. We call the specific serosal membrane of the heart's pericardium, which means around the heart. Okay, and we also have a parietal, okay, and visceral, and here's your pleura, which again we just saw in the previous slide. Pleura, and then there's just the lung name for these serosal membranes. So guys, I hate the terminology. There's a duplication in terminology, and also the problem is when you get membranes that carry out specific functions on specific organs, we give those membranes their own specific names to avoid confusion. It might confuse you, but not doctors. So moving on now, we're done with epithelium. Let us look at now connective tissue. So as we look at connective tissue, this is the most abundant and widely distributed tissue. It's literally associated with every other body tissue. Literally intimately involved and interwoven in it. So it's found almost everywhere. It's also a highly variable tissue. We're going to see that this tissue is mostly not made of cells. It's mostly made of something called a matrix. I don't mean like the Matrix movie, whatever, but it's mostly made up of a substance called a matrix that is secreted by the connective tissue itself. Okay, and as we get into bone and cartilage and other organ systems, we're going to get back into this whole idea of the specific connective tissues found in them. So there are 4 classes of connective tissue. We're going to see that there's connective tissue proper. That means it fits all the criteria of what a connective tissue is, all the parts. We then have what's called cartilage, which is actually a modified form of connective tissue proper. And then we have bone tissue, which is kind of related to cartilage. So it is a modification of connective tissue proper. And then is the blood, which just kind of throws everybody out. But instead of having what's called a solid matrix, blood has a liquid matrix that's full of many connective tissue type proteins. So blood in itself is a connective tissue because it does connect the body by literally transporting plasma throughout the body. So what are the major functions of connective tissues in general? We find that they bind and support. They also allow flexibility of movement, we're going to see. They form cushions and barriers. They protect. They protect from bacteria. They protect from dehydration. They protect from gaining too much water. They protect from some type of small damage to the body, trauma. They also insulate. For example, fat cells belong to the connective tissues. They can provide something that keeps heat in the body, that can actually keep coolness away from the body. And it can also cushion, that's another form of insulation. And then connective tissue can transport materials from one place to another. Particularly the blood does that. So when we look at a comparison of the different connective tissue types, we can see the connective tissue proper has connective tissue cells, which are shown right here. That's the cell. We're going to later call that a fibrocyte. That's the cell. And you can see here is the matrix. And in connective tissue proper, the matrix looks it looks like it has, you can see the fibers in it. It's kind of uniform. And we're going to see it's very usually dense. Then we get into the cartilage, because that's kind of like the next step. Cartilage, the matrix now, has like this solid, clear matrix that you can't really see the fibers anymore with exceptions. What's really neat about this is the cells are trapped in a cavity. You don't see that cavity here, because what happens is that these fibers eventually get broken down and these cells secrete this new type of gummy material, glassy looking material around them and leave a cavity we're going to eventually call the lacuna sac. So they are now prisoners in here, locked in their own kind of gummy matrix. Bone tissue, take that and add calcium salt, something called hydroxyapatite. This is now solid and rigid. It's like chalk, like limestone. That's what makes bone bone. Bone comes from cartilage. Cartilage is formed typically from a connective tissue proper origin. Blood, it is surrounded by a liquid we call the matrix that they live in. And this is a fluid type of connective tissue that has literally more cells than we usually see in the connective tissue. Connective tissue, for the most part, is mostly matrix and not as much cell. And in connective tissue, unlike epithelium, the cells are typically not connected to each other tightly. If they are connected, it's very loosely. And we'll see that literally only in bone. So, what are the characteristics of connective tissue? Okay, connective tissues are produced from this embryological tissue called mesenchyme. And mesenchyme is basically a group of immature cells that eventually turn into these things called fibrocytes. We will learn this a little later, again, when we look at the skeletal system. Okay, so this mesenchyme tends to take on a shape, and then it then fills itself in and helps using these cells called the fibroblasts that mature and then produces secretions and a new matrix around them. But usually the mesenchyme is a very high cellular thing that contains the stem cells of these things called fibrocytes or chondrocytes, you'll learn, or osteocytes. Okay, and again, the cells in the mesenchyme are separated by a very thin matrix. Okay. Aside from this, the cells and the matrix, we now have other components of connective tissue too. We have this material called ground substance, and this just means that stuff that kind of fits in with the matrix and flows around the cells. So usually what this ground substance does, it's a liquid medium that allows materials to pass through either extracellular fluids or through small blood vessels called capillaries to keep these cells nourished. So usually the ground substance is going to be interstitial fluid. It could also be adhesion proteins that sometimes hold cells together and sometimes hold the cells to the matrix itself. And and we also have proteoglycans, okay, which have various jobs, okay, in the connective tissue matrix. And of course, lastly, the structural component and most important in the connective tissue is the cells. So the cells are what secrete the matrix, eventually, particularly in a mature connective tissue. So we find that there's different maturity levels of connective tissue cells. So there's this term called blast. It's a suffix. So we have the term fibroblast. Fibroblast just means it's a cell that later on will produce fibers. When you see the term site at the end of a connective tissue cell term, it means a mature functioning cell that does its job. So the specific generic type of connective tissue cell is called the fibroblast. They come from the mesenchyme, and this is the first of the maturity levels of the cells. Now, guys, in cartilage, fibroblasts mature into chondroblasts. In bone, fibroblasts mature into, we think, a chondroblast, or maybe directly into an osteoblast. Osteos meaning bone. This is a very confusing situation that scientists are not fully, basically, have knowledge on yet. But fibroblasts in general produce connective tissue proper. A modification of the fibroblast called the chondroblast produces the matrix around cartilage. And then, of course, osteoblasts, which are modified type chondroblasts, they secrete bone. Now, the adult tissue is called, of course, chondrocyte, fibrocyte, or osteocyte. Now, there's one type of connective tissue cell which is very unique, and it's called a hematopoietic cell. Whoa, what a name. Poietic means to generate, hemato means blood. These are specialized blast cells. We call them hematopoietic stem cells that are found in the bone marrow. And what they do is they mature into the actual blood cells themselves, which we will call white blood cells, mast cells, red blood cells, whatever. So know this terminology, because when we start talking about cartilage, bone in particular, we're going to be talking about how these osteoblasts, osteocytes, chondrocytes come into effect. This is also true of tissue healing in general. So now let us jump into the specific types of these four categories of connective tissue. And just to give you an idea what you're looking at, you're going to learn later, this is what's called areola connective tissue. And we're going to focus on more of this in class as we look at the histology specimens. So you can see there, and this shows like every cell you need to see in the connective tissue. So there's these things called collagen fibers, and there's one right there. These are thick fibers made of a protein called collagen. And this is an elastic fiber right there. It has a little different chemical composition. It's made of a protein called elastin, and this is what gives stretchy. So if you were to pull your skin out, the fiber that prevents you from pulling your skin out, that holds it in place and gives it firmness, is the collagen. The elastic fiber is what allows it to snap back. Unfortunately, as you get older, you lose elastic fiber, and it doesn't snap back as much, and if you pull it out, it might stay there. And then there's what are called reticular fibers, and these are actually these are also made up of collagen, and this looks like right here. There's one right there. It's deeply stained. Okay, so these are sort of like what more give they support an organ or support a tissue, giving it kind of like a rigidity. So it makes it a little this connective tissue a little less fluid and more solid. And you'll hear of what are called reticular capsules. So these fibers are there more for shaping. These are for strength, that's for elasticity. We can see a fat cell there. They're found in, they make up a connective tissue themselves, or are found in other types of connective tissue. White blood cells are commonly found in connective tissue. So that's a lymphocyte. That's a macrophage and a mast cell. These are all neutrophils. This is all the major categories of white blood cells. And then this is very important because here now is a fibroblast, but that means that this cell is actually actively producing tissue. You might find a mature one right next to it that's really just kind of sitting there waiting, called a fibrocyte. So when we look at, again, the origin of connective tissue, is you get this mesenchyme tissue. And this is what mesenchyme looks like. It's a bunch of fibroblasts, actually fibroblast kind of stem cells, okay, that eventually grow up to become the categories of fibrocytes you see in this lecture. So they're in a gel type, almost gooey type matrix. They're just kind of hanging out, waiting to do a job based on their body location. And this tissue can also disappear and also can reform in areas too. But usually what happens is the mesenchyme helps to lay down the body plan, where everything is going to be and is in place as the body is developing and then matures later. So here's a mesenchymal cell. Don't worry about stromal cell. And what they can do is undergo what's called osteogenesis, chondrogenesis, myogenesis. Ooh, look at it. It could actually produce muscle cells. Wow. Okay. And then we have here fibroblasts, which form connective tissue proper. And then fat cells are produced by what is called adipogenesis. So what causes this differentiation to occur are placement in the cell, genes that are switched on and off in these cells based on who their neighbor is and based on receptors that allow them to respond to different hormones. This is an incredibly complex phenomenon, and this is why the probability of having a birth defect or some type of defect in this development is pretty common, because of this whole idea of one cell turning into many is very complicated. So when we go into an overview of the connective tissues, we're going to look at, just like we did with epithelium, their description, function, and location. So when we look at connective tissue proper, okay, what are the types? We have loose, and that's what you just looked at before, areola, and we have what are called dense. Loose means there's just a lot of cavities, or it's mostly made up of cell, okay, or it just has a lot of uniform fiber throughout it that's still kind of loose, but it means there's spaces in here. There's almost no space to see through when you look at this type of connective tissue. So to begin with the loose connective tissue, we have what's called areola or areolar connective tissue, depends on how you want to pronounce it. And sometimes this is called loose connective tissue, but remember there are three categories. So call it areola. Particularly when you look at the other loose ones, you'll see that this is definitely distinct. What makes this most unique and identifiable are these thick collagen fibers right there. There they are. That's a thick collagen fiber. And collagen usually stains very lightly. Very lightly. Okay. Collagen, again, is what makes up bones. It's just like, teased apart fibers. These provide the strength for the connective tissue. Now, to look a little further, these dark ones here, and that one's just a little smaller, are elastic fibers. The elastin protein usually stains very dark. So whether this is pink, purple, or blue, this is usually going to be very light. Don't go by colors on slides. It just has to be stained that way. This would be kind of dark, very dark, to the point where it's another color, sometimes black, sometimes much darker. And then they don't label the reticular fibers, but those are reticular fibers. They're like skinnier collagen fibers, so they don't stain as well too, and are typically hard to see. So there's your collagen, elastic. Notice the elastic, that one kind of sproinged. It's kind of spring-like and rubber band-like. You can see what it looked like in here, what looked like the actual fibroblasts or fibrocytes, we don't know. And then we might even have some white blood cells in there. So again, this is areola. Look at it, look at a bunch of slides. Here, fat tissue is a subcategory of loose connective tissue, but generally we call it adipose tissue. And look at this, this is one adipose cell. That's the cell right there. Sorry, missed that. So there's the nucleus. Whoops. There's the nucleus. It's pressed against the cell membrane. And that's fat. The fat actually during the process of making the slide fell out. It's usually yellowish. And that's showing adipose tissue in the breast. You find it all over the place, particularly subcutaneously below the skin. This is adipose tissue generally has no matrix, but there is a little filler tissue in there and also blood vessels and other material that can be in there. Okay, white blood cells. But that's adipose tissue. Don't confuse it with, when we looked before, the squamous, because you can see this is one individual cell. It's not a group of cells. And these adipose tissue cells are huge. So they're almost as big as what you see in the slide as the alveoli that we looked at previously. This is called reticular tissue. This is kind of like areola connective tissue. in which the reticular fibers are much, much more condensed. And here we see the reticular fibers are taking up the stain very well. These form, again, reticular fibers form capsules. They form sort of like a cardboard complex or spaghetti type complex inside that organ that makes it rigid but sometimes crumbly. So we've gone out of the loose connective tissue. Let's look at the dense connective tissues. And this one you'll see a lot. It's a beautiful one. It often gets confused with smooth muscle and sometimes with skeletal muscle. So, and again, we'll deal with this in class as we go through this. I'm going to give you a little indicator on how to tell these apart. And you'll have pictures of slides to look through yourselves. So this is called dense regular. And what they mean by regular is look at that flow pattern. Very even. Those are the fibers. Look at that. And this is probably in a contracted form. This comes from like a tendon. Okay, and here's what a tendon is. Tendon holds together muscle and bone, or it could be from a ligament, which holds together bone and bone. Okay, there's your fibrocyte or fibroblast, depending on what it's doing. If this is mature, it is a fibrocyte. If it's actively secreting, it's a fibroblast. And I know it's a little confusing, but it's essential to know, particularly when pathologists look at these tissues. So this is all fiber. This is all fiber, really, compressed. And usually these fibers could be collagen, could also be elastic. Primarily collagen is what you find in connective tissue. This is called dense irregular. I'm not going to make you look at this. I mean, you'll look at this one, but not memorize it. It's very difficult. So instead of seeing nice patterns, there's a chunk there, a chunk there, a chunk there. This is sort of like taking clay and just smacking little pieces of clay on something over and over till you cover it in random little blobs. These usually form capsules. By having this pattern, it's not allowing, just like a stretching and contraction or movement in one direction or acting like a cable. Regular acts like a cable. Irregular is more like a capsule or a cushion that acts almost like you're putting cement around something. So this helps to form shape and allows multiple directions of stretching and twisting and movement. Because look at this. Here's your rotator cuff right here. And this is part of sometimes rotator cuff damage, is you damage a certain section of this and it limits movement. So these are more coverings that allow flexible movement, but they could also be delicate and tear in certain regions. This is dense, what's called elastic. So instead of being filled with regular layers of collagen, we find elastic fibers. These provide support. They also provide stretching. And these are almost exclusively found in large blood vessels like the aorta and the vena cava, particularly the aorta, because these could withstand the stretching of blood pressure. Now, if something happens to these fibers where they're breached, you're looking at now the ability to form an aneurysm, where this could actually stretch and bubble if those fibers are breached somehow or weakened, and eventually collapse that structure and sometimes even rupture it. So this is found usually in large arteries, lining that large artery. And this is what helps also contribute to the blood pressure, because this is associated with muscles that can help this elastic fiber press down on and support, the rigidity of these large vessels. Okay, so we're out of the connective tissue proper. There are other ones, which I'm sure you really don't want to know. So again, hyaline is not just fibers. It's a solid or gooey matrix that's almost like a liquid-like gel that could either have or not have fibers associated with it. So this is a totally different type of substance that we're looking at. And again, the types are what are called hyaline cartilage, elastic, and fibrocartilage. This is going to be the most common one we see in class. This is associated with particularly skeletal muscular system. So when we look at hyaline cartilage, this is the matrix, and note it's a goo. Every now and then you'll see a fiber, but it's a goo. It's a goo that's very much like dried Elmer's glue or something like that. So it's a goo. So that's your matrix. Here's the cells. So these are chondrocytes or chondroblasts, depending on what they're doing. That one's probably a chondroblast doing its job. Those are probably mature chondrocytes. Notice the little owl eyes, we call it, or funny face. That's how you distinguish this. That's a gap called the lacuna. So you know you're in hyaline cartilage when you see basically, okay, the cell itself, very big nucleus, and then the cavity, and then the matrix wrapped around it. So these are prisoners in the matrix. These cells are away from blood supply. They're hardly fed, and they basically are a minimum existence maintaining this matrix. The problem is when they're damaged because of the lack of blood supply, they're very slow to heal. And it's a danger when we start looking at damage to cartilage, particularly cartilage that lines the joints. When it wears away, it can wear away faster than these cells could replicate, particularly in older people where the blood supply is not as good, or in diabetics. So they're found in joint cavities. Read this up about them. This is a very common type of cartilage. Then there's what's called elastic cartilage. So what you do is you take hyaline cartilage and put elastic fibers in there. Remember, elastic fibers dye blue. Okay, sometimes they can be denser than this. So here's the cell. That's your lacuna space. This is the matrix, and there's the elastin fibers. So what this does is if it's thin enough, it allows you to have flexibility without cracking, because hyaline cartilage can crack. But if you put elastin fibers in there, they hold it in place and let it stretch and bend, but then snap back. And this is typical of your ear right here, what's called the auricle of your ear. You could bend it, wiggle it, and it snaps back. It'll be horrible if you bend it and it stays bent. So the elastic fibers in there allow it to snap back. And usually we ask this on a test, because a classic example is the ear, the cartilage in the ear. And then there's something called fibrocartilage. I'm not going to make you memorize this one. This is a very difficult type of cartilage. It is hyaline cartilage that's much more spaced out, much fewer cells, which means this stuff heals very slowly because there's few cells, okay, and there's fibers that run with it. This is a cushioning stuff. This is almost like foam, a very rigid foam. Okay, so here it is. It's found in the intervertebral spaces, and it cushions you. Allows your spinal column to have weight put on it. So your vertebrae basically can take the weight. They do compress. That's a problem, but it forms this wonderful surface that allows compression. And then there's bone, which we also call osseous tissue. Bone is hyaline cartilage, where the cells in there get replaced by what are called osteocytes. And you're going to learn about something later called osteoclasts. So bone looks like tree rings. Okay, so that's a bone unit. Later we're going to call an osteon. These actually in red are the bone cells. They're related to fibrocytes, except we call them osteocytes because they form bone or osteoblasts. These are connectors. Notice those little things there? These are connectors between the osteocytes, and that's how they get nourishment. Because in here, that's you're going to learn later, it's called the Haversian canal. That's a blood vessel. Blood vessels run through there, and blood literally feeds these cells here, and they feed the other cells that ring out. So this is a bone unit. We're going to later on call it an osteon. So that's bone. Think of tree rings. And there's the cells. Okay, that's called the Haversian canal. You're going to learn a little later, in which a blood vessel is located in. And guys, look at this. This is growing all the time. Bone is not dead. It's constantly these things dying. Okay, let me do that darker. These things dying, decaying, and then these rings growing bigger and bigger and filling in. And you can see he actually, we'll clear this, he actually is filling in for what looks like a dead osteon that was here and a dead one that was there. So this is a forever growing tissue. Bone is always responding to the environmental stress. It's always growing, replacing itself. Very important tissue. Then, last but not least, of the connective tissues, there's blood. And blood is mostly cellular. There's your matrix. It's blood plasma, but guys, inside of here are all sorts of little proteins and fibers, including clotting fibers, that make up the matrix. So there is protein, but it's usually suspended in this plasma, in the blood plasma. So this is liquid and protein. It's a little kind of thick substance. There's the cellular component. You're going to have to learn that there are white blood cells and red blood cells. Red blood cells carry oxygen and some CO2 and other materials. They sometimes transport salts, just kind of accidentally. And then there's the white blood cells, which fight infection. And they don't show platelets in here, but because those are involved in the clotting process, and those are kind of rare to see. Yay, we're out of the connective tissue. Now it's going to be a nice stretch home. So we have the nervous tissue. It's not nervous because it's nervous. Look, it's excitable. No, nervous tissue is excitable, which means that it responds to electrical current and can pass electrical messages, which is how they communicate. They communicate through electrical signals that produce a neurotransmitter, a chemical that literally goes from one cell to the next in a particular direction to cause electricity to form. So think about these cells communicating to each other, like that one communicating to this one long distance by electricity, builds up in his body, travels down, it sends off a little chemical that touches this one, is literally spit out on that cell, and then it produces electrical impulse too. Very, very, very interesting thing. And they're also secretory because they do produce what are called neurotransmitters and also compounds that act like hormones. They also release ATP as a hormone to communicate with other nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is made up of what we call neurons, we're going to see, and glial cells, which are right there, those tiny little dots. Okay, that was it for nerves. Now we get on to muscle tissue. So with muscle tissue, we're going to look at this a little more detail when we look at the muscular system. So muscle tissue is divided into three categories, and these three categories have subcategories, particularly when we talk about skeletal muscle a little later on. So with muscle tissue, we have smooth muscle, which is also called involuntary. That means your brain tries not to control it. Because guys, you don't sit there controlling your own peeing. You don't just say, hey, I want to pee and force it out. Your body really sends a signal that tries to get it out. It tries to produce peristalsis. Of course, you can control the opening that lets it happen or not. Okay, your intestines, you don't control how fast your poop or food travels down your intestines. The body does this through parts of the brain that are what we call involuntary or subconscious. You don't think about it. Now, some people can take control of it. It's possible, but usually not to the point where you could run the body this way. Because imagine have to think about everything, including your own heart beating. So smooth muscle is a very weak muscle. Okay, it's very distinguishable by, it actually looks like, I hate to tell you this, it looks like connective tissue, but you will see some tricks on recognizing it because it does have a lot of cells jam-packed together. Those are like waves of cells all hooked up to each other. Then there's cardiac muscle. It is also involuntary. That means you don't want to have direct control over it, although some people can control their own heart rate. I've seen actually people that do this, very well-trained people. Okay, and it's recognized by these unique, cell types that are connected by, again, we talked about this, a gap junction that we call an intercalated disc. We'll see that in lab. And then there's skeletal muscle, which actually the muscle cells are multiple cells that get huge. I mean, literally all the way off the slide. So a muscle cell can be large, made up of dozens and dozens and dozens of smaller muscle cells all fused together. And you can see the multiple nuclei here that make them up. So this is typically under voluntary control. Now, some skeletal muscles under what's called reflex control. That means you really don't have to think about it, but your brain is working hard about it, and you can control it. You can stop a reflex from occurring. But if you try but for posture is partially what we call voluntary, partially involuntary. We're not going to worry too much about that right now. But anyway, so this is usually something you can control. Both of these muscle types are what we call striated. That means the muscle contraction is limited to one major direction that allows that to be a very strong shrinkage. So these two tissues shrink, in this direction. They shrink like this, get smaller, whereas this kind of acts like a big blob that the whole thing just kind of pulsates. and produces a non-direct. So this is skeletal muscle under the microscope. Again, this is one cell. One cell that goes on and on and on. It's big. We don't see nuclei in this one, but let's go to another one, and you can see the multiple nuclei in here. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 5 to this one that make a 6 in just that stretch of muscle cell. So there's another muscle cell, and what we call the striations. You can see right here, these are actually cytoskeleton proteins that allow the muscle to contract this way. That means you kind of squeeze it in these directions to contract it. Okay, so that's what these allow. These little white caps, you see there, compress and shrink the tissue. So this is what skeletal muscle looks like. Please know this, what it looks like under the microscope. It's very, 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 very unique. Cardiac muscle, let's look at the individual cells here. So that is one cell. That's one cell. And notice it's kind of branched a little. It's kind of weird. That's one cell. That's a nucleus. That's a nucleus to the cell. That's actually adipose tissue right there. Isn't that funny? That's a broken nucleus that fell out. So when we look at a cardiac muscle cell, that's something called the intercalated disc. That's a connector between two skeletal cardiac muscle cells, and that's where you find these little things called gap junctions where fluids can pass from this cell to this cell, cytoplasmic fluids. So these have strong contractions, but the main contractions propel blood through the body. And then last of the muscle, we see smooth muscle. Now look, guys, look at all the nuclei. And notice the cells. These are called spindle cells. Spindle cells. Let me do that in blue. They're shaped like little spindles. A spindle just meaning a needle. So there's one, and there's one, and there's one, and that's another. So they're single cellular, one nucleus, and they're all fused together in this weak sheet. They have no striations. Notice, no dark lines. I mean, under the microscope, you will see some, but inside the shape of these cells, instead of having striations like this that make these compress or stretch out, in one direction, okay, what happens with them is their cytoskeleton is like this. It's a mishmash. And when this contracts, all it does is kind of shrink it a little or move it into a weird shape. And that allows, when you're lining a tube with it, for it to compress stuff and produce a motion called peristalsis. So smooth muscles are involuntary, usually controlled by the brain or controlled by the local tissues themselves or by themselves. Smooth muscle could actually stimulate themselves. Okay, but it's very weak contractions. Now to kind of end this, okay, let us look a little at tissue repair. Because tissue repair takes into account our own embryological development. It takes into account a lot of cell signaling. It takes into account cell division and also differentiation. How do we take a damaged area and replace it back to normal? So we can see that there are various types of injuries that could damage tissue. Amputation, which leaves kind of like a blunt end. Avulsion, which literally leaves this kind of flap-like gap. Crush injuries will damage tissues. Puncture, okay, abrasion, meaning you literally, instead of cut into something, you're eroding it off. This unfortunately happens around blisters, and if you scrape yourself, what is that called, a rug burn. And then there's lacerations, which are very deep cuts that go into multiple layers of tissue. So when we look at the steps in tissue repair, the first thing that's going to happen is the process of inflammation. That means the immune system has to kick in and has to recognize there's damage there. And this is what's interesting when you get like a little paper cut. You might feel pain, but there might be any inflammation, and it just kind of sits there unhealed. And that's why sometimes they take a long time to heal. Now, if you had a paper cut that generated blood, now you got all the factors they are needed to cause inflammation. So usually what has to happen with tissue repair, and this includes bone and anything, is there has to be a lot of dead cells releasing all sorts of chemicals, but also bleeding into that wound. And guys, this sometimes what happens with bone fractures is you get a fracture of a bone that does not encourage bleeding into it, and that could remain forever. Okay, particularly crush damage to the bone will crack it but not induce bleeding, and then it does not heal. And sometimes what doctors have to do is either break that area or drill into it or break a blood vessel near there. So what happens when tissue is damaged is inflammatory chemicals are released. That means damaged cells, damaged blood vessels, release chemicals like what are called histamines, cytokines, other factors that attract the immune system. This stage is so important. People with immune system depression or suppression, that means people with AIDS, with a disease like what's called adenosine deaminase deficiency, people are under stress, elderly people with weak immune responses will have slower healing. Now, people with allergies may have abnormal healing, where you might actually get the body overreacting and damaging the tissue worse. So when we look at repair, that inflammatory response can either work for you or against you, but you have to have it for normal tissue repair. But unfortunately, sometimes, depending on a person's condition, the immune system restricts or worsens the damage. Then what happens is that some of these chemicals released here cause the increase in size of blood vessels. By increasing blood vessels, which is called dilation, you're now increasing the amount of blood flow to the area. And on the skin, this makes the skin feel warmer because you're now taking warm blood from the inside of the body, because your skin is much cooler than the inside of the body. It makes it feel warm. Guys, in internal organs, when they're undergoing inflammation and blood vessel dilation, they don't feel warm because they already are warm. So you're not going to see this heat come out, only in the cutaneous system. As the blood vessels dilate, they also stretch out and they become leaky. That means chemicals within the blood leak out. And these are usually chemicals associated with the immune system. And also clotting starts to occur. That means the formation of a scab is already beginning. And if this doesn't occur, there's nothing to seal together, either temporarily or permanently, that wound. What does it look like in the first stage? And this is all in your book. So there's the gap. Obviously, blood got into there, because if it didn't, there'd be a cut. So there's things leaking out of those blood vessels. A clot that we call a scab is starting to form. So inflammation sits in. We call the troops in to help fix this damage. It's not being fixed yet. There's all your little cytokines, inflammatory chemicals. They're invading the area. And what happens is the scab is a temporary patch. That's why I don't pick them off, because they're a temporary patch. They also act as a matrix to tell what to repair. So without that scab, these epithelial cells here have nowhere to go to grow into to fix that. Some surgeons, if this gap is too big, you get a permanent scab or something called a keloid, which will never heal. So sometimes that has to be cut out. And then this and this sew together to make those cells come together. So what happens is this becomes a matrix, also for collagen to fill in here too. So the goal is to fill in this whole scab to make that the same as all of this. And unfortunately, nerves can't be repaired and certain glands can't be repaired in an injury. So that's the inflammation stage. Then the next stage of tissue repair is we're on the road to what's called the recovery. And in this stage now, we're organizing and restoring blood flow. We're replacing the clot with what's called granulation tissue. This is sometimes called the granulation stage. Okay, and what we mean by that, by granulation, is that the tissue kind of looks nondescript, it's spotty. But what's neat about the granule stage is that this is now forming the platform for all the cells that were killed to fill in the gap. So the epithelium starts to regenerate, if there is epithelium. Fibroblasts come in to replace the lost connective tissue, and all the dead cells and materials are eaten by white blood cells. That's what we mean by phagocytized. So that's kind of step two. This is what it looks like. Notice that gap now is being filled in by epithelium. Connective tissue is a little slower, so we don't see as much connective tissue being fixed at that time, but the epithelium is almost totally repaired except up here as that slowly gets degraded, because what happens is new skin, and this is kind of a problem, the new layer of skin is here. And what it basically does is push up that scab as skin cells are added to eventually the scab pops out. Again, that's why I don't pop out a scab, because you might leave this opening still there that's exposing young unprotected skin. So now we're restoring the area as part 2. With part 3 is now what's called the complete regeneration and fibrosis stage. That means now the scab is gone, the granular tissue is being filled in, and we have hopefully 100% recovery of a replacement of what was there before. This doesn't always occur, particularly in people that are subject to what are called keloids. Okay, Keloid. This is very common in darker skinned people, particularly Native Americans, dark Asians, and African Americans. Okay, we find that what happens is that you have this granular tissue that fills in, and unfortunately, granular tissue is like a stem cell tissue. It can keep growing and growing to these giant lumps, and if you try to remove that tissue, it grows back to more tissue. So hopefully the regeneration or fiber stage takes place. Because what that does is it's almost everything's back to normal, except you see a little scar. And in some people, the scar doesn't go away. In me, I know these scars last for years, and sometimes they go away if it doesn't keloid. In bone, it could take 20 years for this fibrotic area to disappear. So you end up with this little thick density of bone that has to be replaced by the bone tissue that's consistent with what's there. That's why when you die, we can see remnants of all the scars you've had, unless you're like 100 years old and some of these bone scars kind of disappeared. Fresh scars in the skin we could also see, because sometimes it can take a long time for those to go away. So to understand how our mature tissues get there, because the body is complex, but what's really kind of nice is we can divide the body into 3 embryological layers that are placed down to form, the particular tissues that make up your integumentary system, that make up your guts in general, and make up your inner body parts. So when a baby is developing, the first thing that happens is you get these 3 layers forming. And most creatures have these 3 layers and develop very much like us. So you have this ectoderm layer, which is a group of stem cell type cells that just form on the outer surface of the body and form like a covering. And then you end up with this endoderm. And why am I mentioning that first? Because that's actually the second layer that forms. This endoderm, which is like a little inner tube here. It's a little tube or group of cells inside, encapsulated by the ectoderm. And then you have this mesoderm, which eventually comes in later and fills in the cavity. Think of this as like a hollow ball now, between the ecto and the endoderm. So that's your mesoderm. Now, these layers are formed early in embryological development. And what they do is they help to form the primary tissues in particular regions of the body that give you your body structure. So for example, ectoderm forms your skin. And believe it or not, your whole nervous system starts out as a layer of skin in particular locations on your body. Isn't that nice to know? And you're going to learn that a little later when we look at the nervous system, particularly the central nervous system. So ectoderm forms skin and nervous system. Mesoderm or mesoderm forms muscle and bone, connective tissue, particularly muscle and bone. That's why muscle is related to connective tissue. It's kind of interesting. Okay. And then we have your endoderm, which forms the lining, I should say the digestive system and lungs, that little lining that runs from your mouth to your anus and includes your respiratory system and many other organs associated with that. So we have ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm. Ectoderm meaning outer body parts, middle body parts to innermost body parts, usually skin and nerve, digestive system, respiratory system, that internal tubular system, and then muscle and bone, and certain types of connective tissues too that are not bone. So when we're a fetus, we start out as a single stem cell. That's the union of sperm and egg. And believe me, sperm could act as a stem cell, and so could eggs, but they are what we call haploid. They have half the DNA. And in rare situations, I've never heard of a sperm growing up, but you can try. But in humans, it's kind of, not a good thing because of the Y chromosome being dysfunctional. But in the female, a haploid egg, that means an egg that only has half the DNA, can grow up into a thing. This happens in certain creatures, okay, and particularly in insects, we see this, and other simple creatures. This is also possible in humans, but the problem is that the amount of DNA that's in half a cell creates a problem with regulation. So what happens is we have the cell, which is a combination of mom and dad's DNA, becomes what we call the pluripotent cell, pluripotential. It has the ability to divide and differentiate into any type of cell, any organism, in any type of thing in the body. So what happens is that we can divide these stem cells into what are called adult blood cells and other stem cells. So that is so neat that blood is such a specific structure, a connective tissue in itself, that it needs its own separate origin of stem cells, whereas the rest of the body comes from another stem cell. So this is called the adult hematopoietic stem cell. So what happens with us is the egg determines I'm going to make blood and I'm going to make everything else. So when I make the blood, this goes to a layer of different types of stem cells that eventually make the mature cells that you have in your body. Okay, and there they are. These actually mature further into other cells. Isn't that kind of nice? So when we look at the rest of the body, these other stem cells, we have those that produce muscle, those that produce nerve cells, okay, and also cardiac cells. Isn't that nice? Cardiac muscle forms from ectoderm, and then this can form liver cells, okay, and then we have these interstitial cells, which you'll see a little later, what they're involved in. So what happens is here's how your body forms, and it forms from series and series of cells that first mature, and then those cells accumulate into tissues, and eventually tissues into organs. Very complex process, very complex. And if you want to look at this of what we really look like, this is us. We are a flat sheet of creature, and you can see our ectoderm right there. So this is going to form your skin. That crease there is going to form actually your brain and eventually your spinal cord, not your vertebral column. That's mesoderm. That comes later. So that's your spinal cord, and that spinal cord will eventually branch out and send out little nerves that form the rest of the nervous system, which is kind of cool once it's actually inside here. So that moves actually to inside of here. Okay, we can see the layer of epithelium right there. Okay, then we have what's called the mesoderm, and that's going to form most of your muscle, connective tissue, and bone. The nervous system does eventually move into this and get surrounded by it. And then we have the endoderm, which is kind of neat because eventually what happens, and you're going to love this, is this ectoderm here kind of eventually wraps around. This whole thing kind of wraps around, and that kind of wraps around to make a tube, a hollow tube, that becomes now the hollow tube that runs from your mouth to your anus, and this becomes your continuous layer of skin. So this is an end to the tissues. Understand that tissues takes into account, you understand cell function from the previous chapters. You also understand mitosis from the previous chapter. You need to know this histology stuff. That means the cytology to really appreciate then the organ systems. So goodbye, and I'll talk to you on the next lecture.